And welcome everybody to another edition of WCBN Sports Socially Distant Sports Talk. My name is Jared Greenspan, and today I'm joined by a very special guest. He has been a longtime on-air personality on the radio and both television for ESPN. You may recognize him from his work with the TV show Mike and Mike, or this current TV show Get Up. He also has a radio show called Greenie, which debuted last month. He is Mike Greenberg. Mike, thanks so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure, Jared. Nice to be with you.
All right. So, Mike, I know you're really busy. And as I mentioned, you just had a new radio show, Greenie, returning to your roots, so to say, on the radio airwaves. I'm curious as to how that's been going so far. Obviously, with sports picking up, you certainly have more to talk about, I imagine.
Yeah, the last few months have been unlike anything. I'll start with March. So March 18th was the last day that we did Get Up from our studios in Lower Manhattan, and we were thrown out, just the wrong word, but we were no longer allowed to work from there. And so I went up to Bristol, where I spent the first 21 years of my career at ESPN, and did the show from there every single day. And it was a really remarkable experience trying to navigate doing a sports talk show at a time when there was no sports. Mm-hmm. And so to now have this, and as you say, yeah, we came back. I've been back in the city for a week now for Get Up. We have the radio show up and running since the middle of August. And to have gone from a time when we were just trying to come up with anything to talk about to a place where our cup just literally runneth over has been delightful and encouraging. I mean, yesterday you had a full slate of NFL action. You have a stunning NBA development in which Denver forces a game 7 that I don't think anybody saw coming. You have a 5-set men's final at the U.S. Open. You have a no-hitter thrown in Major League Baseball, and that's not even the entirety of it. So, right now it is sort of like shooting fish in a barrel to come up with good material for a sports talk show. And I'm having spent 5 months just trying to make up anything I could think of. I'm very grateful for it.
And I mean, obviously, as you said, there's everything going on in sports right now. It's a really busy time, certainly in contrast to what we had for the better part of the summer, really. I'm curious as to what the process is like for you, whether on Get Up or your radio show, deciding what to talk about. I mean, I know you have like limited time. The radio show's 2 hours. How do you decide what merits being covered?
Well, Jared, that's really the job. The most important part of my job, I would say, is having a finger on the pulse of what American sports fans are going to find interesting. So I know that you are from New York. And so I know, you probably grew up listening to WFAN, and what they can do, a place like that station, they know exactly what their audience is interested in, because they have the Yankees and the Mets and the Knicks and the Jets and whatever it is. And that's true in every market. I started out locally in the Chicago market. And in Chicago, when I was working locally, we would talk about the Bears and the Bulls and the Blackhawks and the Cubs and the White Sox, and that was easy. When you start doing a national show, which I did with Mike and Mike starting in January of 2000, and now starting up Get Up and all the rest of that, the most important thing is to figure out what subject matter is going to be of interest to the largest possible number of people. So the analogy or the example I will always use is doing a local talk show. You can do an hour on a pitching change that the manager either did or didn't make last night, because for the most part, everyone is not only interested in that, but they're passionately invested in it. If I ever even reference a pitching change that got made in one random baseball game yesterday, I'm losing 99% of my audience. That's really what it's about. It's about broadening. That's you just want to appeal to as many people as you can, from one coast to the other, and the largest cross section of sports fans that you can. So there are different ways to help you figure out. First and foremost, at ESPN, we have all of this data that we receive. We're constantly polling sports fans, and so that's a huge advantage that someone like me has. But then social media is also a good way of doing that. So what I can tell you is when I'm doing a show, if I'm on a topic, I will have my mentions open. And when I sort of start diving into a topic, I will just glance every now and again, and I will see what kind of response I'm getting. And what I mean by that is, I don't care if people are liking or disliking what I'm saying. I only care that they're reacting. So if I see 10 tweets fly in a minute, I move on to something else. I know I'm not touching a nerve. If I see 300 tweets fly in a minute, I think, okay, I've got them. They're into this. So that's a wonderful tool that we didn't have, obviously, when I started. That is of great benefit now. And there are some other ways that you go about it. And ultimately, you're just making educated guesses. And I've been doing this long enough now that I'm well educated in it, but it's still a guess of what material it is that your audience is going to be interested in. And that, I would say, again, that's really the most important part of this job.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, the WFAN point, I feel like is perfect. Those guys can talk about the Mets game and why Luis Rojas left the starter in too long, and they could talk about that for like an hour, like you said, whereas you have to cover bigger topics, definitely.
Well, see, so the point with that is that if my show is, we need to play in Chicago and in Dallas and in LA and in Pittsburgh, and they don't know who Luis Rojas is.
Yeah,
not only if
definitely.
Luis Rojas walked down Michigan Avenue in Chicago, if he walked into, is the Brown Jug still there in Ann Arbor, which was the place I used to hang out when I would go visit? Okay, if he walked into the Brown Jug right now, what percentage of people do you think would even know who he was?
0.
No, I mean something close to 0. There's a lot.
Yeah.
There are a lot of kids from Long Island and Michigan, so I'm guessing a lot of them are Met fans. So some of them will know who he is, but the overall percentage is not big. Now, what percentage of those people are going to know who Patrick Mahomes is? Are going to know who LeBron James is? Are going to know who Tiger Woods is? You know, those are the hits that you have to play. It's not that different from almost any other format of talk. You know, if you're you're programming a music radio station, you're going to play the hits. That's where that expression came from. Well, we really do the same thing. I'm going to, as often as I possibly can, I'm going to go to pro football, which everyone is interested in. I'm going to go to the biggest stars in the NBA, who most people are interested in. I'm going to go huge, big picture baseball, because people aren't interested in anything but that until you get to the postseason. College football, you have to be really careful because it's very regionalized. Hockey, you have to be very careful because it's a niche audience. They're very passionate, but it's very small. Golf, if Tiger's not involved, golf, it happens to be my favorite sport, but if Tiger's not playing, I'm the only person interested in it. So that's really the job. The job is figuring out what material to cover. There are a lot of people who could cover it, but you have to make sure that you're covering the right stuff.
And so my next question is sort of wondering, I guess, what a day in the life for Mike Greenberg is like. I'm sure it's different now with everything going on, or it has been different. But like preparation-wise, or what time do you get ready, bringing on guests, all sort of that stuff. If you could just sort of walk me through what a normal weekday is like for you.
Well, so a normal weekday for me starts at about 4:45 is when I get up, and I will catch up as quickly as I can on whatever it is that happened last night that I missed. And I have a variety of ways of doing that. I have a staff of people who will have sent me a ton of notes, and there's social media and any, all the same ways that other people can catch up on things. So I'll spend a little time catching up on that. My show meeting for Get Up is at 6. So I'll be in the office at 6 o'clock, and we will go over all the stuff we want to do on the show that day, and we'll fine tune. Most of the rundown and everything else was created the night before, but all of that is just a placeholder because we really are at the mercy of the events mostly that take place at night in sports. So we'll then start reconfiguring that. You sort of put the pieces together almost like a jigsaw puzzle. And then we go on at 8, and I do that show from 8 to 10. And now, as you mentioned, for the last month, I have a radio show that starts at noon. So I will usually get myself something to eat after that, and then I start getting ready for the radio show. I'll get on a, FaceTime or something like that with the producer of that show, and we'll go over whatever it is we, have planned for that. And usually a lot of that is informed by what we did on Get Up. We'll bring a lot of the same stuff to that. So I usually have a pretty good idea of what I want to do. By 10 o'clock, I pretty much know what I want to do at noon. And then, so I do that until 2 o'clock. And then I come back to my apartment. I live here in Midtown. And now I've got, some stuff to do. I have a few other things that I work on, but as far as the ESPN stuff, right before you and I started this Zoom, I was on a conference call with the TV staff going over what we want to do tomorrow morning. So it really is, show prep is really, I'm on the air for 2 hours, I always say, and the other 22 hours are show prep. I mean, you just have to be constantly aware of all the things that are happening in the world of sports, because it is kind of round the clock and you got to be ready. So I'm just following the same stuff everyone else is. And when time permits, I play as much golf as I possibly can. That's my biggest concern, in all honesty, in taking on the radio show, was the way it was going to interfere with my golf time, because golf is a real passion for me, and I really enjoy it and love it. And for all these years, when I get off the air at 10 o'clock and my day is done, I can go play. So I've been playing a little bit less for the last month, and I do miss that. Then I'll, have dinner with my wife and my son. My daughter is in college like you are. She's at Northwestern and waiting for classes to start. Spend some time, with my wife and my son. And then Stevie and I will sit and start watching whatever sports are on that night, because I would be doing that even if it wasn't my job, but I need to see what's happening.
And you've been at ESPN for a long time now. I have sort of two questions about your origins, really, in all this. The first is when you decided that this was something you wanted to do for a living, for a profession. And the next is really, how did you get the job at ESPN? I know it didn't happen right away after you graduated, but how did that sort of develop?
Yeah, so the first one, my mother will tell you, and I believe my mother and your grandmother are very close friends. In fact, I know your grandmother, Marge Ehrenfeld, very well, and for a long time, and she is my mother's dearest friend. But my mother will tell you that when I was 5 years old, I would sit in front of the TV and I would announce the football games. And I don't have an active recollection of that, but I believe her. So I think I knew it as soon as that. I like to say that I knew it as soon as I figured out I was never going to be the starting point guard for the New York Knicks. I'm a kid like you. I'm just a kid who grew up in New York City, and I love sports. And I wanted to be, I figured out at a very young age that I was never going to be able to make a living in sports by being a player. So I started trying to figure out a way to make sports my life. I knew I wanted to be around sports in some way. And honestly, when I was a kid, there was an announcer who I hope you've heard of named Howard Cosell. I don't know if that name means anything to you or not, but he was an icon and a legendary figure. And he was the person that I wanted to emulate. I wanted to be Howard Cosell. So as long as I can remember, I wanted to be a sportscaster. As far as how I got my first job, I got a job at a radio station as a production assistant right out of college. I was a PA at a station called WMAQ Radio in Chicago, which was an all news radio station. And I got paid $6.50 an hour, and I worked from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. And I would do everything from bringing the anchors coffee to bulking carts, which don't exist anymore, to calling the National Weather Service to update the temperatures every hour, which of course you don't have to do anymore. And all sorts of other things that you don't have to do anymore. And I just kept going over to the sports department whenever I could and asking, is there anything here I can do? Is there anything here I can do? And one thing led to another, and I eventually got to do some stuff in the sports department. And when I got my opportunity, things went pretty well. And then they started the first all sports radio station in Chicago, which was WSCR, The Score. in January of '92, and I got hired as a producer. And I was producing the afternoon talk show, and I offered to go over to Chicago Stadium and cover games at night after my shift for free. And they didn't have anyone to do that, so I got to do that, and it was great. I loved that work, and I did well enough at it that the Bulls had Michael Jordan at that time, and this was like at the very, very height of him and them. They decided that we needed, as a station, someone to cover the Bulls full time. And by some miracle, they decided to give that job to me. So with almost no regular on-air experience, I became the electronic beat reporter for the Bulls when I was 24 years old. And I started covering them and traveling with them. I traveled with Michael and those teams for years, and it was great. I mean, it was better than great. I'm underselling how great it was. It was incredible. And I wound up parlaying that into a local TV job at a TV station called CLTV, which was the local 24-hour cable news channel in Chicago. So you're from New York, right? So, in the suburbs of New York, they have News Channel 12. There are these local 24-hour cable news channels all over the country in these different markets. So I did sports there for a while. And in 1996, ESPN started a network called ESPN News, which was like a 24-hour of Sports Center. They would just basically be like a round-the-clock wheel where we'd constantly be doing sports, just nonstop sports news, kind of the CNN headline news of sports. And they hired a bunch of young anchors from all over the country, and I was one of them. So that's how I got to ESPN. I started there in August of 1996. I did that. I anchored on ESPN News for 3 years. And then the radio network decided they were going to do a full-time morning show with Mike Golick, and they needed a partner for him. And I had a lot of radio experience, of course, from my days in Chicago. So they tried me out, and I went in there with him for one day. I had never met him in my life. We did one day together, and they offered me the job that day. And that's how that started. And the rest is sort of history. The Mike and Mike thing, was a miracle. And it completely changed my life. And, all of the good things that have happened to me since then came because of that. So I've been at ESPN now, unbelievably, 24 years.
Crazy. Do you have a different approach, let's say when you're on the radio versus on television, whether it's preparing differently or targeting to the audience? Just sort of curious about that.
Yeah, so the two are very much the same and yet completely different. And the difference, while it may sound obvious, is actually the most important part, which is television is intrinsically a visual medium. And radio obviously does not include video or anything visual. So even Mike and Mike, at the height of our popularity, we had almost half of our audience was on the television, but we still always had to plan the show purely as a radio show. Because the minute you start making the video central to the presentation, you alienate anyone who's just listening. So if you watch Get Up, you will see we have all sorts of different ways that we utilize tape. So Dan Orlovsky, for example, this morning did a terrific video breakdown of what we saw from Cam Newton in New England and all of that, and with arrows and pointing and see this here, watch him make this guy miss and all sorts of things like that. But you can't do that on the radio, obviously. The minute you say, look here, so Mike and I, back when we were doing the radio show and it was on TV, we made a rule that you could never reference the video, because the minute, if you're driving, if you're in your car right now and you're listening to me on the radio and you hear me say, look at the move he makes right here, you can't see that. I'm changing the station. There's something about that would offend my sensibility as a radio listener. So that's by far the biggest difference, is that when you plan and execute a television broadcast, you are planning and executing something that is visual. You are putting something on the air that people are going to see, and you want to be as appealing to their eye as you can. When you are planning a radio broadcast and executing a radio broadcast, you are purely talking directly into their ear. And that may sound very obvious, but when you really sit down and start making your plans, that distinction is critical, and it informs everything we do. So much of the rest of it is the same. But the most important piece, which is that piece, is completely different.
Got it. And now sort of wrapping things up with one last question that I've got to ask, because I know you have opinions on it. We are both suffering Jets fans, and I want to know do the New York Jets have any hope this season, or is all of that dashed after yesterday's miserable game?
Come on, Jared, you know the answer to that question. I mean, the Adam Gase, here's what I will tell you.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, I'm older than you are now. My kids are grown up. I have a daughter who's in college. I may not be that far away from having grandchildren. And maybe in the next 10 years or so, I will have a grandchild, a grandson, or granddaughter who's
Mm-hmm.
interested in playing organized football when they're in 3rd or 4th grade. And if they are, I wouldn't let Adam Gase coach that team. He would be in over his head coaching that team. And I consider him to be the problem completely. And look, they have a lot of other deficiencies. They're a terrible team. But he's the biggest problem they have, and they will never get better with him regardless of what players are on the team. And the biggest concern I have is that the quarterback is regressing. And I use this as an example on the radio today. But you will remember the very first pass Sam Darnold ever threw, the very first play he ever had as a Jet was on a Monday night against Detroit. And he threw a pass that as he was winding up to throw it, every football fan that has ever seen a game yelled, "Don't throw that." And it was a pick six on his first play. And I remember thinking to myself, good, let's get that out of our system. That's a mistake that every rookie is going to make. He made it on his very first play. He'll never make that mistake again. And this Sunday, in his 3rd season, he made a pass that was even stupider than that. He regressed. He is regressing under the coaching of a guy who was hired exclusively because he's supposed to be able to work with quarterbacks because he's an offensive guru, but he can't do it. He's the worst. And not only that, but the players hate him. It's a disaster. So not only do the Jets have no hope this season, but it is also just a completely lost season because they will fire Gase for sure. And now you're just on a hamster wheel. Now you're just starting over again with a new system and all this new stuff and new coaches. And that's exactly the way to ruin a young, talented quarterback, which I'm terrified is what they are doing with Sam Darnold. So it's a disaster. And rooting for this team all of my life, if I may use an indelicate word, has sucked, and it is going to continue to.
Well said. Well said. Maybe one day, you never know, but certainly doesn't look good for the Jets for now. That'll wrap things up for us. Again, to all our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Always appreciate you guys watching our YouTube channel for WCBN Sports. This was another episode of Socially Distant Sports Talk. Mike, thanks so much for joining me. It was awesome to talk to you, vent a little bit about the Jets, and hear about your day-to-day life at ESPN.
My pleasure, Jared. Thank you very much for having me. Continued success. And everybody stay healthy there in Ann Arbor. I don't know if we're going to get football back or not. I think we're going to get basketball is the sense that I get. I am a Big Ten fan myself and alum and parent. I went to Northwestern. My daughter goes to Northwestern. I hope we get to see our teams back out there on the fields and the courts and everything else soon. But in the interim, everybody stay safe.
Yep. All right. Thanks for listening, everybody. And we'll catch you next time on WCBN's Socially Distant Sports Talk.